C.S. Lewis picks up by saying, "Other people wrote to me, saying, 'Isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention, something that is put into us by education?' I think this is a misunderstanding. The people who ask that question are usually taking it for granted that if we have learned a thing from our parents and teachers, then that thing must merely be a human invention. But of course this is not so. We all learned the multiplication table at school. A child who grew up alone in a desert island would not know it. But surely it does not follow that the multiplication table is simply a human convention, something human beings have made up for themselves and might have made different if they had liked. I fully agree that we learn the rule of decent behavior from parents and teachers and friends and books, as we learn everything else, but some of the things we learn are mere conventions which might have been different. We learn to keep to the left of the road, but it might just as well have been the rule to keep to the right. And others of them, like mathematics, are real truths. The question is to which class the law of human nature belongs. There are two reasons for saying it belongs to the same class as mathematics. The first is, as I said in the first chapter, that though there are differences between the moral ideas of one time or country of those of another, the differences are not really very great, not nearly so great as most people imagine, and you can recognize the same law running through them all, whereas mere conventions, like the rule of the road or the kind of clothes people wear, may differ to any extent. The other reason is this. When you think about these differences between the morality of one people and another, do you think that the morality of one people is ever better or worse than that of another? Have any of the changes been improvements? If not, then of course there could never be any moral progress. Progress means not just changing, but changing for the better. If no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or Christian morality to Nazi morality. In fact, of course, we all do believe that some morals are better than others. We do believe that some of the people who tried to change the moral ideas of their own age were what we would call reformers or pioneers, people who understood morality better than their neighbors did. Very well then, the moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more clearly than the other. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either. You are in fact comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as a real right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas that some people's ideas get nearer to that real right than others. Or put it this way, if your moral idea came to be truer, and those of the Nazis less true, there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about. The reason why your idea of New York can be truer or less true than mine is that New York is a real place, existing quite apart from what either of us thinks. If when each of us said New York, each meant merely the town I'm imagining in my own head, how could one of us have a truer idea than the other? There would be no question of the truth or falsehood at all. In the same way, if the rule of decent behavior meant simply whatever each nation happens to approve, there would be no sense in saying that any one nation had ever been more correct in its approval than any other. There would be no sense in saying that the world could ever grow morally better or morally worse. I conclude, then, that though the differences between people's ideas of decent behavior often make you suspect that there is no real natural law of behavior at all, yet the things we are bound to think about these differences really prove just the opposite. But one word before I end. I have met people who exaggerate the differences, because they have not distinguished between differences of morality and differences of belief about facts. For example, one man said to me, 300 years ago people in England were putting witches to death. Was that what you would call the rule of human nature or right conduct? But surely the reason we do not execute witches is that we do not believe there are such things. If we did, if we really thought that there were people going about who had sold themselves to the devil and received supernatural powers from him in return, were using these powers to kill their neighbors or drive them mad or bring bad weather, surely we would all agree that if anyone deserved the death penalty, then these filthy quislings did. There is no difference of moral principle here. The difference is simply about a matter of fact. It may be a great advance in knowledge not to believe in witches. There is no moral advance in not executing them when you think they don't exist. You would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mouse traps if he did so because he believed there were no mice in the house. If you take a thing like a stone or a tree, it is what it is, and there seems no sense in saying it ought to have been otherwise. Of course, you may say a stone is the wrong shape if you want to use it for rockery, or that a tree is a bad tree because it does not give you as much shade as you expected. But all you mean is that the stone or tree does not happen to be convenient for some purpose of your own. You are not, except as a joke, blaming them for that. You really know that, given the weather and the soil, that the tree could not have been any different. What we, from our point of view, call a bad tree is obeying the laws of its nature just as a good one. Now you've noticed what follows. It follows that we usually call the laws of nature, the way weather works on a tree, for example, may not really be the laws in the strict sense, but only in a manner of speaking. When you say that falling stones always obey the law of gravitation, is not this much the same as saying that the laws only mean what stones always do? You really do not think that when a stone is let go, it suddenly remembers that it is under orders to fall to the ground. You only mean that, in fact, it does fall. In other words, you cannot be sure that there is anything over and above the facts themselves, any law about which ought to happen, as distinct from what actually does happen. The laws of nature as applied to stones or trees may only mean what nature in fact does. But if you turn to the law of human nature, the law of decent behavior, it is a different matter. The law certainly does not mean what human beings in fact do, for as I said before, many of them do not obey this law at all, and none of them obey it completely. The law of gravity tells you what stones do if you drop them, but the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do and do not. In other words, when you're dealing with humans, something else comes in and above and beyond the actual facts. You have the facts, how men do behave, and you also have something else, how they ought to behave. In the rest of the universe, there need not be anything but the facts. Electrons and molecules behave in a certain way, and certain results follow, and that may be the whole story. But men behave in a certain way, and that is not the whole story. For all the time, you know they ought to behave differently. Now, this is really so peculiar that one is tempted to try to explain it away. For instance, we might try to make out that when you say a man ought not to act as he does, you only mean that the same as when you say that a stone is in the wrong shape. Namely, that what he is doing happens to be inconvenient to you. But that is simply untrue. A man occupying the corner seat in the train because he got there first and a man who slipped into it while my back was turned and removed my bag are both equally inconvenient, but I blame the second man and do not blame the first. I am not angry, except perhaps for a moment before I come to my senses, with a man who trips me up by accident. I am angry with a man who tries to trip me up even if he does not succeed. Yet the first has hurt me and the second has not. Sometimes the behavior which I call bad is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite. In war, each side may find a traitor on the other side very useful. But though they use him and pay him, they regard him as human vermin. So you cannot say what we call decent behavior in others is simply the behavior that happens to be useful to us. And as far as decent behavior in ourselves, I suppose it is pretty obvious that it does not mean the behavior that pays. It means things like being content with 30 shillings when you might have got £3, doing schoolwork honestly when it would have been easy to cheat, leaving a girl alone when you would like to make love to her, staying in dangerous places when you could go somewhere safer, keeping promises you would rather not keep, and telling the truth even when it makes you look like a fool, which happens to be the whole Christianity thing. But anyways, some people have objected and said that morality is only what benefits society, and it's not from an external moral law from a moral lawgiver. And here is a wonderful refutation by C.S. Lewis. Some people say that though decent conduct does not mean what pays each particular person at a particular moment, still it means what pays the human race as a whole, and that consequently there is no mystery about it. Human beings, after all, have some sense. They see that you cannot have real safety or happiness except in a society where everyone plays fair, and it is because they see this that they try to behave decently. Now, of course, it is perfectly true that safety and happiness can only come from individuals, classes, and nations being honest and fair and kind to each other. This is one of the most important truths in the entire world. But as an explanation as to why we feel as we do about right and wrong, it completely misses the point. If we ask, why ought I to be unselfish? And you reply, because it is good for society. We may then ask, why should I care what's good for society, except for when it happens to pay me personally? And then you'll have to say, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. You are saying what is true, but you are not getting any farther. If a man asked what was the point of playing football, it would not be much good to say in order to score goals, for trying to score goals is the game itself, not the reason for the game, and you would really only be saying that football was football, which is true, but not worth saying. In the same way, if a man asks what is the point of behaving decently, it is no good replying in order to benefit society, for trying to benefit society, in other words, being unselfish, for society, after all, only means other people, is one of the things decent behavior consists in. All you are really saying is that decent behavior is decent behavior. You would have said as much if you had just stopped at the statement, men ought to be unselfish. But that is where I do stop. Men ought to be unselfish, and they ought to be fair. Not that men are unselfish, nor that they are like being unselfish, but that they ought to be. The moral law, or law of human nature is not simply a fact about human behavior in the same way the law of gravitation is, or may be, simply a fact about how heavy an object behaves. On the other hand, it is not merely a fancy, for we cannot get rid of the idea, and most of the things we say and think about men would be reduced to nonsense if we did. It is not simply a statement about how we should like men to behave for our own convenience, for the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly the same as the behavior we find inconvenient. We may even find the opposite. Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever we call it, must somehow or other be a real thing, a thing that really is there, not made up by ourselves. And yet it is not a fact in the ordinary sense in the same way of our actual behavior is a fact. It begins to look as if we shall have to admit that there is more than one kind of reality. That is, in this particular case, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely a real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us.